72 kilometers off the coast of Chiapas, at 48 minutes past 9 on the morning of July the 17th, the floor of the Pacific Ocean broke. Not a tremor. Not the small forgettable shudder that rolls through southern Mexico most weeks and is gone before the coffee has cooled. A magnitude 7.3. 15 kilometers down, shallow enough that the energy arrived sharp and sudden, hard enough that 22 million people across 3 countries felt it before they had finished waking up. The sea itself flinched. Tide gauges from Chiapas to Puerto Madero recorded a wave, small, only 1/3 of a meter, but real and measured, the ocean answering the ground. And then, almost as quickly, it was over. No collapse on the scale this region has known before. No mass casualty. A yellow alert, 2 injuries, a scatter of landslides across the border in Guatemala, and a world that had moved on by lunchtime. But the scientists watching did not move on, because this stretch of coast has broken before. And the last time the rock here shifted the way it shifted on the 17th, in living memory, close enough that people still carry the scars, it did not stop at a warning. So the question that every seismologist along the Middle America Trench is quietly turning over tonight is this one. Was the 17th of July the planet settling an old debt, or was it the first quiet installment on a far larger one? Before we go any further, if you find something worth staying for here at Earthquake, take a second to like and subscribe, so you don't miss any of our nightly reads. And leave a comment to tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The morning the sea flinched. At 48 minutes past 9 in the morning, local time, on the 17th of July, most of the coast of Chiapas was already awake. This is not a place that sleeps late. The fishing boats had long since gone out from Puerto Madero. In Tapachula, the largest city near the coast, the markets were open, the streets were full. The day was hot and ordinary, and already halfway toward noon. And then, without any warning that any human being could have felt in time, the ground began to move. It did not start as violence. It never does. It started as a low, deep sound, more felt in the chest than heard in the ear. The kind of sound a very large truck makes passing very close, except that it did not pass. It grew. The hanging lamps in the markets began to sway. Water slopped over the rims of buckets and basins. Dogs, who feel these things a half second before people do, were already moving, already low to the ground. And then the shaking arrived in full, and for a handful of seconds, the solid world stopped being solid. 72 kilometers to the southwest, out under the ocean, a section of the Earth's crust roughly the size of a city had just slipped. The United States Geological Survey would fix the numbers within minutes. Magnitude 7.3, depth 15.2 kilometers, which by the standards of the planet is shallow, and shallow is the word that matters most in that sentence. A deep earthquake spends much of its strength pushing up through tens of kilometers of rock before it ever reaches a living soul. A shallow one arrives almost whole. 15 kilometers is close enough to the surface that the energy comes up fast and hard, and the shaking, when it reaches the coast, is sudden rather than slow, a shove rather than a roll. I want you to hold on to the shape of what happened here, because everything else in this story bends back towards it. A piece of the seafloor offshore, in one of the most seismically restless corners of the entire planet, moved hard enough to be felt by 22 million people, and then, within the space of an ordinary morning, appeared to settle back down and do nothing more. Both halves of that sentence are true. The thing that separates the people who study this coast from the people who felt it and forgot it, is understanding that the second half does not cancel the first. Let me give you the human geography of that morning, because the numbers only mean something once you can feel the size of them. When the USGS models an earthquake, it does not just record the magnitude, it estimates how many people felt each level of shaking, from the faint sway that only the most sensitive notice, all the way up to the violent motion that throws objects from shelves and cracks the walls of poorly built homes. For the earthquake of the 17th, the numbers came out like this: Around 67,000 people felt what the scientists call very strong shaking, the kind that is genuinely frightening, that sends people running for doorways. Around 627,000 felt strong shaking. 3.3 million felt moderate shaking, enough to rattle a whole house and stop a conversation cold. And light shaking, the kind you feel in your feet and in the swing of a ceiling lamp, reached roughly 22 million human beings, spread across southern Mexico, across Guatemala, and into El Salvador. Picture that for a moment. Not a city, not a region, a span of the Earth's surface holding 22 million people, all of whom, in the same handful of seconds, on the same ordinary morning, felt the floor of the world move under them. Most of them were in no danger at all. That is precisely the point. An earthquake this size, at this depth, this far offshore, reaches out and touches millions of people who will never be hurt by it. And in doing so, it reminds an entire corner of the world, all at once, that the ground they trust is not as fixed as it pretends to be. On the coast itself, closer to the epicenter, the shaking was serious. In Tapachula and the smaller towns along the shore, people poured out of buildings into the streets. The oldest instinct there is, to get out from under anything that can fall. Phone networks staggered under the weight of everyone calling everyone at once, and along the immediate coastline, a second fear arrived on the heels of the first, older and colder than the fear of a shaking building. The fear of the sea. Because when a large earthquake happens offshore, the danger does not always end when the ground stops moving. If the seafloor lifts or drops sharply enough, it shoves the entire column of water above it, and that shove becomes a wave, and that wave becomes a tsunami. Within minutes of the rupture, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued its assessment. Hazardous tsunami waves were possible along the coasts of Mexico and Guatemala. The forecast called for waves of up to a meter above the tide line for the nearest shores, with smaller waves possible much farther afield, along the coasts of El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. For a few hours, a very long list of coastlines held its breath, and here the earthquake of the 17th showed the first sign of its strange, double character. Because the tsunami came, and it was real, and it was measured, and it was almost nothing. The tide gauge at Chiapas recorded a wave of 33 centimeters. At Puerto Madero, 32. A gauge far out in the deep ocean registered a single centimeter. These are not the walls of water that live in the human imagination when we hear the word tsunami. 1/3 of a meter is a wave you could stand in. But I do not want you to file that number away as trivial, because it carries a piece of information that matters enormously, and we will come back to it. The sea moved. The earthquake was strong enough and shallow enough and displaced enough of the seafloor to reach up and lift the ocean itself, even if only by the length of a forearm. Hold that. By the middle of the day, the shape of the event was clear enough for the authorities to begin standing down. The tsunami advisory was lifted. The coast had not been swept away. Across the border in Guatemala, the picture was much the same. Evacuations, precaution, some minor landslides where slopes had already been softened by the rainy season, schools closed for the day as a sensible caution. But no catastrophe. In the whole of the felt area, across 3 countries and 22 million people, the confirmed human cost of the initial earthquake was 2 injuries in southern Mexico. 2. The USGS captured the situation in a single technical phrase that is worth translating, because it is the hinge on which this entire story turns. They issued what is called a yellow alert, their system, which is designed to forecast the likely scale of an earthquake's impact within minutes of it happening, estimated that economic losses would probably amount to less than 1% of Mexico's national output, and that the risk of large numbers of deaths was low. In plain language, the machine that watches for disasters looked at the earthquake of the 17th and said, "This one, is not the disaster. This one is serious, and this one is frightening, and this one is not the disaster. And this is the moment where most of the world closed the tab and went back to its afternoon. A big number, a scary morning, no bodies, no ruins, move on. If you only read the headline and the death toll, the earthquake of the 17th of July is a non-event, a near miss, a story about nothing happening. But I want you to notice something about that reaction, because it is the oldest mistake in the study of the living earth, and it is the reason this channel exists. We are a species tuned by millions of years of evolution to notice the loud and the sudden and the immediately dangerous. A predator in the grass, a fire, a collapse. We are exquisitely bad, by contrast, at noticing the slow, the silent, and the delayed. And earthquakes, the largest and most consequential of them, live almost entirely in that second category. The shaking is the loud part. The shaking is the small part. The thing that actually matters, the thing that decides whether a coast lives another quiet century or loses a city in 90 seconds, is happening silently, deep underground, on a timescale that has no interest whatsoever in the human attention span. So the seismologists did not close the tab. While the rest of us moved on, they leaned in, because to a trained eye, the earthquake of the 17th was not an ending. It was a signal, and in the hours and days that followed, the coast kept sending it. The aftershocks began almost immediately, as they always do, the ground around the rupture resettling itself, each one a smaller echo of the main event. At least 5 of them were magnitude 5 or greater, earthquakes that, on a quiet day in a quiet place, would each have been news in their own right. 2 days later, on the 19th, a magnitude 5.5 aftershock rolled out from beneath the sea, and even that lesser shock, that echo of an echo, was felt by 8.5 million people. That is the fact I want to leave you sitting with as we go deeper. Not the 7.3, the 8.5 million. 2 days after the world had decided that nothing had happened off the coast of Chiapas, a mere aftershock, a footnote, was still large enough to be felt by more people than live in most nations on Earth. The coast was not finished speaking, it had, in a sense, barely begun. And to understand why the people whose job it is to listen were so unwilling to look away, you have to leave the surface entirely. You have to go down, past the seafloor, past the reach of any drill, into the machine that built this coast and every disaster it has ever produced. Because the earthquake of the 17th did not come from nowhere. It came from something, and that something is still there, still moving, still loading, exactly as it was on the 16th, and exactly as it will be tomorrow. Part 2. The machine beneath the trench. Down then, away from the light, away from the noise of sirens and phones, and the 22 million heartbeats that felt the 17th of July arrive. Down past the wet floor of the Pacific, past the last cold reach of sunlight, past the place where any drill humanity has ever built would give up and stop. I want you to keep descending in your mind, kilometre after kilometre, into rock that has never once been touched by air, because everything that happened that morning was decided down here, in the dark, long before it climbed to the surface to be felt. The shaking was the ending. This is the machine that wrote it, and it is genuinely a machine, not in the loose poetic sense, but in the real one. It has moving parts, it has a fuel source, and a rhythm, and a direction of travel, and it has been running without pause and without witness, for longer than there have been eyes to watch it. Picture the coast of Chiapas not as a fixed line where land meets sea, but as the visible lip of an enormous slow grinding engine that plunges down into the planet at a shallow angle and keeps going, tens of kilometres deep, hundreds of kilometres inland, out of all sight. What you call the coast is only the part of the machine that happens to be dry. Here is the shape of it. Off the shore of southern Mexico, running parallel to the coastline, like a seam sewn into the ocean floor, there is a trench. It is called the Middle America Trench, and it is one of the great subduction zones of the Earth, one of the places where the outer shell of the planet is not merely cracked but actively consuming itself, folding one piece of its own crust back down into the heat it came from. Imagine a long, narrow depression gouged into the seabed, deeper in places than the tallest mountains are high, stretching for thousands of kilometers. That trench is not a valley. It is a doorway. It is the exact line along which one plate of the Earth's surface bends downward and disappears beneath another. To understand what that means, you have to hold two things in your mind at once, and I want you to build them slowly. The first is that the skin of the Earth is not one continuous shell. It is broken into pieces, vast, rigid slabs called tectonic plates, each one dozens of kilometers thick, each one floating on hotter, softer rock beneath, each one drifting at a pace so gradual that it defeats the human sense of motion entirely. The second thing is that these plates are not all made of the same stuff. Some of them are continental, thick, old, relatively light, the rock that your cities are built on. And some of them are oceanic, younger, thinner, and crucially, denser, heavier. And when a heavy thing and a light thing are pressed together hard enough, for long enough, physics has only one answer for what happens next. The heavy one goes under. That is subduction, and it is the beating center of this entire story. So let me give it to you the way you would actually feel it. Hold your two hands out flat in front of you, palms down, fingertips almost touching, as if they were two plates of the Earth meeting at a boundary. Now slide one hand slowly beneath the other. The lower hand tilts down and vanishes under the upper. The upper hand rides up and over. That downward diving hand is the oceanic plate. That is subduction, the descent of a slab of the planet's own surface back into the mantle that made it. Off Chiapas, the diving hand has a name. It is the Cocos plate, a broad sheet of dense oceanic crust born far out in the Pacific. And for millions of years, it has been sliding, patiently, relentlessly, beneath the edge of the North American plate, and its neighbour, the Caribbean, wedging itself down and under and away into the dark. How fast? This is where the machine reveals its cruelty, because the honest answer sounds like nothing at all. Roughly 6.5 centimetres a year, 6.4. I want you to actually measure that against something in your own body, because the number is meant to disarm you. Look at your fingernail, that soft, ceaseless growth you never notice, the growth that means every few weeks you trim it away without a thought. That is almost exactly the speed at which an entire plate of the Earth is diving beneath a continent. Not a landslide, not an avalanche. The pace of a growing fingernail applied to a slab of rock the size of a country, sustained without rest across geological time. That is the engine's throttle. That is how fast the fuel is loaded, and it is loaded like a conveyor belt. That is the image I want you to keep. Picture a conveyor belt running horizontally toward a wall, and at the wall, the belt turns and plunges straight down through the floor, carrying whatever sits on it into the dark below. The Cocos plate is that belt. It arrives from the deep Pacific, travels toward the coast, reaches the trench, and there it bends and dives, feeding itself downward into the hot interior of the planet at the speed of a fingernail, ceaselessly, whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not it is night, whether or not a single human being alive has any idea it is happening. And here is the first place I need you to feel the through line of everything I am telling you. All of this, the diving slab, the consuming trench, the 6.5 centimetres a year, happens in perfect silence. There is no grinding roar. There is no sound at all. The largest and most important motion beneath your feet makes no noise whatsoever. The noise, when it finally comes, is only the failure of the silence. Hold on to that. We will come back to it, and it will matter more each time. Because here is the complication, and it is the whole reason the machine is dangerous instead of merely majestic. The plates do not slide smoothly. That is the thing that seems impossible until you sit with it. If the Cocos plate simply glided down and under, frictionless, greased 6.5 centimeters every year with no resistance, there would be no earthquakes here at all. The coast would descend into the planet as quietly as it consumes it, and Chiapas would be one of the calmest places on Earth. But that is not what happens. The two plates where they touch are rough. They are rock pressed against rock, under unimaginable pressure, and they catch. They snag. They lock together along their contact, and they stick. And when they stick, the conveyor belt does not stop. This is the part that undoes people, so go slowly with me. The deep engine keeps running. The Cocos plate, far out to sea and far below, keeps pushing forward at its fingernail pace, keeps demanding its 6.5 centimeters a year. But the boundary where the plates meet is frozen, jammed, held fast by friction. So the motion does not disappear. It cannot. Energy is never simply lost. Instead, it goes into the rock itself as strain. The whole enormous slab begins to bend and flex and compress, storing the thwarted movement inside its own body like a spring being slowly, invisibly wound. You already know this feeling, even if you have never thought of it as geology. Think of a door swollen shut in its frame on a humid day. You push, nothing. You push harder, leaning your weight into it, and still nothing, no motion, no give, just the mounting pressure of your effort going into the wood, the frame, the hinges, all of it loading, all of it silent, and you push harder still, and for a long moment the door simply refuses, absorbing everything you have, and then, all at once, with a crack, it gives and flies open, and every bit of the force you were patiently storing releases in a single instant. That releases the earthquake. That single instant when the stuck thing finally slips is the shaking, is the sirens, is the sea flinching, is the 22 million people waking mid-motion, and the long, quiet, straining push that came before it, the years, the decades, sometimes the centuries of a boundary locked tight and loading in silence. That is the part nobody feels. That is the part that does not make the news. The winding of the spring takes 100 years. The unwinding takes 90 seconds. And we, as a species, only ever notice the 90 seconds. Now I have to give you the single most important distinction in this entire video, and I am going to give it to you calmly, because it is the key that unlocks everything that comes after. This one subduction zone, this one machine off the coast of Chiapas, does not make just one kind of earthquake. It makes at least two, and they are profoundly different, and telling them apart is the difference between a footnote and a catastrophe. The first kind is what happens at the boundary itself, the place where the two plates are locked together, the contact where they stick and strain and finally slip. When that locked interface lets go, when the plates unstick along the surface where they touch and lurch past one another all at once, that is called an interface earthquake or a megathrust, and I want you to understand what that word means, because it is not decoration. The megathrust is the seam between two plates, and it is the largest fault surface on the entire planet. These are the earthquakes that hold every record. The greatest earthquakes ever measured were megathrust ruptures, the kind where the boundary slips, not by a meter, but by tens of meters, along a fault hundreds of kilometers long, in a single event. And because the boundary here lies beneath the sea, because the seafloor itself heaves upward when the plates unstick, the megathrust is also the great maker of tsunamis. When the interface goes, it does not just shake the land, it lifts the ocean. Hold that image gently, the ocean lifted, and set it aside for now. We're not there yet, but it is waiting. The second kind of earthquake is stranger and less famous, and you have almost certainly never had it explained to you, and it matters enormously for the 17th of July. This kind does not happen at the boundary between the plates. It happens inside the diving slab itself. Deep down, where the Cocos plate has already plunged beneath the continent and is bending downward into the mantle, the slab is under agonizing internal stress. It is cold and stiff and heavy, and it is being pulled by its own dead weight as it sinks, and it is being forced to bend around the curve of its own descent. And cold, stiff things that are bent hard enough do not just slide, they crack, they tear, from the inside. Here is the analogy I want you to hold, because it is exact. Take a stiff plastic ruler and lay it flat on a desk with one end sticking out over the edge. Now press down on the overhanging end and bend it. Feel where the strain gathers. If you bend it far enough, it snaps. But notice where it snaps. It does not break where it meets the edge of the desk. It breaks somewhere along its own length, out in the body of the ruler itself, wherever the bending has concentrated the stress the most. That is an intraslab earthquake, sometimes called an intraplate earthquake, a rupture that happens within the downgoing slab, not along its contact with the plate above, but inside the diving plate's own cold, bending, self-torn body, often much deeper than the boundary quakes, driven not by the sticking of two plates but by the slab tearing under the pull of its own weight. Two earthquakes, one machine, the interface quake, where the boundary slips and the ocean can be lifted, the intraslab quake, where the slab itself cracks from within as it bends and sinks. They can happen in the same subduction zone, along the same stretch of coast, felt by the same people, and yet they are born of entirely different violence, and they carry entirely different meanings, and, this is the part to keep, they do entirely different things to the stress in all the rock around them. One of them is a warning of a certain kind, the other is a warning of another. And a machine like this one has been making both, in some rhythm we are only beginning to read, since long before the first humans stood on that coast and wondered why the ground had moved. So now, bring the 17th of July back down into the machine with everything I have just given you, and feel where it sits. The magnitude 7.3, 72 kilometers offshore, out over the trench, out over the seam, where the Cocos plate bends down and begins its descent, and 15 kilometers deep, shallow enough that the energy arrived sharp instead of muffled, shallow enough that it reached the surface with its edges intact. Offshore, on the Middle America Trench, in the exact zone where this engine does its work. This was not a random spasm in the middle of a continent. This was the machine speaking from the precise place the machine speaks, in a language seismologists have spent a century learning to read. And that is why they leaned in. Not because a 7.3 is rare here. The coast trembles often, and most of it is forgotten before the coffee cools. They leaned in because of the questions the machine had just refused to answer. Which kind of rupture was it? Did the boundary slip, the interface, the tsunami maker, the record holder, or did the cold slab tear from within, an intraslab crack in the bending plate? At 15 kilometers and offshore, the answer is not obvious, and the two answers do not mean the same thing. And I am not going to overclaim it for you, because the honest work of seismology is slower and more careful than any story wants it to be. But understand this much. Whichever kind it was, the rupture did not simply release stress and end. It moved stress. Every earthquake is also a redistribution. The rock that slips unloads its own strain, yes, but in doing so, it presses harder on the rock beside it, the rock in front of it, the locked patches that did not move. A quake does not only spend tension, it relocates it. And what the 17th of July did to the stress in the rock around it, which locked patches it eased, and which it quietly wound tighter, is exactly the thing the people who listened to this coast could not stop turning over. Because all of it still is happening in silence. I need you to end this descent holding that, because it is the truth the whole machine is built on. The slab is still diving, 6.5 centimeters a year, the pace of a growing fingernail, and it made no sound before the 17th, and it makes no sound now. The strain is still loading into the locked boundary and into the bending slab, the spring still winding, the door still swelling in its frame, and none of it can be heard, and none of it can be felt, and none of it will announce itself until the instant it fails. The engine that built this coast and every disaster it has ever produced ran for millions of years before anyone watched, and it will run for millions after, indifferent, unhurried, on a clock that has no interest in us at all. On the 17th of July for 90 seconds, it let us hear the smallest possible fraction of what it is always doing, and then it went quiet again and kept working, which leaves the question that should be troubling you by now, the one that does not fit the tidy relief of a headline. Because the headline, when it came, said what headlines say. A strong earthquake off Chiapas, no deaths, no tsunami, a frightening morning, and then, mercifully, an ordinary afternoon, and you would be forgiven for exhaling, for filing it away as a near miss that missed, for letting the number, 7.3, no fatalities, stand in for the whole of what happened. But the number is a liar, or at least it is the wrong measure, pointed at the wrong thing. Because the danger in a machine like this one was never really in the shaking you felt. It was in what the shaking told the people listening about the silence that came before it, and the silence that is already, quietly, gathering again. Part 3. Why the small number is the wrong number. So let me ask you the question the way a seismologist would ask it, because a seismologist would not ask it the way the headlines did. The headlines asked whether a magnitude 7.3 was big. That is the wrong question, or rather, it is a question so incomplete that its answer tells you almost nothing about the danger. I want you to set the number down for a moment, that clean, tidy 7.3, and I want you to understand why the people who study this coast for a living looked at that number and did not feel reassured by the absence of collapse. Because the number, the way you have been taught to read it, is lying to you. Not deliberately, not with malice. But by its very design, a single figure on a scale most of us were never properly taught to read. It compresses something vast and jagged into something small and smooth, and in that compression, the truth gets left behind. Here is the first thing you have been misled about, and it is the thing almost everyone gets wrong, because the scale was built by scientists for scientists and then handed to the public without the instructions. The magnitude scale is not linear. When you count from 6 to 7 to 8, your mind does what minds do with numbers. It spaces them evenly. It lays them out like fence posts, one step, another step, another step, each the same size as the last. That is how counting feels. But that is not how this scale works, not even close. The magnitude scale is logarithmic, which is a cold word for a wild idea. And the idea is this: each whole number you climb is not one step up. It is roughly 10 times more ground shaking. The amplitude of the wave that moves the earth beneath your feet grows tenfold with every single point. And the energy released, the actual violence done to the rock, the raw power spent in the breaking, that grows by a factor of about 32 for every whole number. 32 times. Not 32% more. 32 times more. Let me give you the picture, because the arithmetic is useless until you can feel it. Imagine you're climbing a staircase, and you believe, as anyone would, that each step is the same height as the one before. An ordinary flight, easy to climb, easy to picture. That is how you have been reading these numbers. Now throw that staircase away. In its place, imagine that every step is not a step at all, but an entire flight. And every flight is not a flight, but an entire building. And every building taller than the last by a factor you cannot quite hold in your head. To go from a magnitude 6 to a magnitude 7 is not to take one more step. It is to climb the whole staircase again, 32 times over. And to go from a 7 to an 8 is to do that not 32 times, but 32 times 32, more than 1,000-fold leap in energy from the 6 you started at. The gap between a 6 and a 7 is enormous. The gap between a 7 and an 8 is more enormous still, so much more that the word barely stretches to cover it. So when you hear that the July event was a 7.3, and you have somewhere in the back of your mind a magnitude 6 you once felt or read about, and you think, well, a 7.3, that is only a little more than a 6, a bit stronger, a notch up the dial. I need you to stop and correct the instinct. A 7.3 is not a slightly larger 6. It is a different order of violence entirely. It released in that shallow rupture off the coast something on the order of 100 times the energy of a magnitude 6, and the ground it shook with an amplitude some 10 times greater. Picture instead a dial where the numbers are printed evenly around the face, 1 through 10, neat and equal, and yet every number represents 10 of the number before it, so that turning the dial one notch does not add a little, it multiplies. That is the instrument you're actually reading. That is why a small change in the number is never a small change in the world. And yet, even having corrected that, even having grasped that the number is far bigger than it looks, I have to tell you that the number still does not tell you what you most need to know. Because magnitude, that headline figure, that 7.3, is only one of 3 things that decide whether an earthquake is a catastrophe or a footnote, and it is arguably the least important of the 3 when it comes to what happens to human beings on the surface. The other 2 are the ones the headline almost never carries: depth and location. Hold those 2 words because they are where the real story hides. Consider depth first. The same magnitude, the exact same amount of energy released by the exact same length of ruptured fault can be a disaster or a whisper, depending on nothing more than how far beneath your feet the breaking happened. Think of it this way. Imagine a light bulb, bright, burning at a fixed brilliance. And now imagine that bulb buried in the earth. If it is buried deep, hundreds of kilometers down, its light has to claw its way up through all that intervening rock. And by the time it reaches the surface, it is dim, diffused, spread thin across a wide and gentle glow. But if that same bulb, burning at the exact same brilliance, sits just beneath the surface, its light arrives sharp and blinding and whole. Earthquake energy behaves in much the same way. A deep quake spends most of its violence in the rock it has to travel through. The waves attenuate, they weaken, they surrender their energy to the miles of stone between the break and the daylight. A shallow quake spends almost nothing on the journey. It arrives at the surface nearly intact, nearly as violent as it was at the moment of the break. And the July event, remember, was shallow. Around 15 kilometers down, which in the language of the deep earth is barely underground at all, is a rupture pressed almost against the skin of the planet. That is why 22 million people felt it so sharply, so suddenly, before they had finished waking. Not because it was the largest earthquake this coast has ever produced. It was nowhere near, but because it was close to the surface. And what it made, it delivered almost whole. Now hold depth in one hand and pick up location in the other, and you will see how the 2 of them together can make the same number mean opposite things. An earthquake directly beneath a city is a horror. The same earthquake, the same magnitude, the same depth, but 70 or 100 kilometers out to sea is felt by those same millions, and yet harms almost none of them, because the energy that reaches them has had all that distance to spread and soften, and because the place where the shaking was worst, where the ground heaved hardest, was open water, an empty seafloor, harming no one, toppling nothing. This is the strange double-edged truth of the 17th of July. It was both huge and nearly harmless at the same time, and there is no contradiction in that. None at all, once you understand that magnitude measures the size of the event down at the fault, while depth and location measure what that event does to you and the people you love, up here in the light. A 7.3 offshore and shallow can rattle 3 countries and take no lives. The very same 7.3 onshore and shallow beneath a sleeping city would be spoken of for 100 years. The number is identical. Everything else is not. So that is why the small number, the no deaths number, the number that let the news move on by evening, is the wrong number to be comforted by. It measured the wrong thing. It measured the flash of the event, the loud and immediate and visible part, and it stayed silent about the parts that actually govern the danger. But I have kept the most unsettling piece for last, and I want you to slow your breathing for this one, because it is the part that the scientists themselves turn over quietly in the dark. And it is the part that the headline number could never contain, because it is not about this earthquake at all. It is about the next one. There is a comforting story we tell ourselves about earthquakes, and the story goes like this. Pressure builds along a fault, slowly, over years and decades, the way tension builds in anything held too tightly. And then one day, the fault slips, the pressure is released, and having released it, the fault is calmer now, safer, spent, the debt paid, the danger discharged. It is a soothing story. It is also, in the way that matters most, wrong. Because a fault does not exist alone. A fault is not a single stuck door in an empty house. It is one segment of a vast boundary between two plates of the Earth's crust. A boundary that runs for hundreds and thousands of kilometers, divided into segment after segment after segment, each one locked, each one loaded, each one leaning against its neighbours. And when one of those segments slips, it does not simply release its pressure into nothing. It redistributes it. It hands what it was holding to the segments on either side. Let me give you the picture, because this is the idea I most need you to carry out of here. Imagine a row of people, standing close, all of them leaning inward, each one propped against the shoulders of the two beside them. The whole row holding itself up precisely, because every person is bearing part of every other person's weight. Now imagine one of them, in the middle, suddenly steps back and drops out of the row. They are relieved of their burden. Yes, they have released their tension. They are free. But the two people who are leaning on them are not safer for it. They are worse off. The weight that person was carrying did not vanish. It fell onto them. They must now lean harder, hold more, bear a load they were not bearing a moment before. And if either of them was already close to giving way, that sudden new weight may be exactly what tips them over. Or imagine a rope, a thick rope, made of many strands wound together. And imagine that rope pulled taut, straining, holding a great weight. When one strand snaps, the rope does not relax. The strand that broke is simply no longer sharing the load, and so every other strand must now hold more than it did before, each one loaded harder, each one closer to its own breaking point than it was an instant ago. Or, if you want something closer to home, imagine a stuck drawer in an old dresser, wedged tight, and you press it, and it finally jerks free with a bang, and in jerking free it shoves the frame, and the drawer beside it, the one that was sliding fine, is now jammed hard in its track, bound up by the very motion that freed the first. This is real. This is not speculation, not a fringe idea, not a doomsayer's flourish. It is established science, and it has a name, Coulomb stress transfer, and it describes precisely this. The way the slip of one patch of fault changes the stress on all the patches around it, sometimes easing them, yes, but sometimes loading them, nudging them closer to their own failure. And the United States Geological Survey, in its assessment of the July 17th rupture, noted exactly this, that the event redistributes stress onto adjacent segments of the boundary between the Cocos plate and the North American plate, the very boundary that has built this coast and every disaster it has ever produced. I want to be careful here, careful and honest, because honesty is the whole point. Stress transfer does not mean a larger earthquake is coming. It does not mean this segment has doomed its neighbour. It means only this, that the moderate quake you felt, the small one, the harmless one, may have quietly moved a larger neighbouring danger closer to its own edge rather than further from it. Not certainly, not predictably, but possibly, and that possibility is not nothing, and it is invisible, and it happened in silence beneath the sea while the news was already moving on. And do you see what that does to the through line I have been holding with you since the beginning? The shaking you felt on the 17th, the sharp arrival, the flinch of the sea, the 22 million waking hearts, that was the loud part, and the loud part was the small part. The redistribution of stress underground, the quiet handing off of load from one locked segment to the next, along a plate boundary, the length of a coastline, That is the large part, and it made no sound at all. It shook no windows, it woke no one, it will never trend. The earth, as it always does, did its most consequential work in perfect silence, on a time scale that has no interest whatsoever in whether we were paying attention. The coast is not done twitching either, and this too follows a law, a real and measured pattern, not a guess. After a main shock of any size, aftershocks come, and they come in a rhythm that seismologists have understood for well over a century, a rhythm named Omori's law, and it describes a decay, a fading. Roughly, the number of aftershocks falls off with time in a predictable slide, about half as many second day as the first. Fewer the day after that. Fewer still, the earth settling its disturbed rock back towards stillness in a long tapering exhale. But hold on to the word roughly, and hold on to the word long, because for an event of this size, the tail of that decay does not end in a week or a month. The Geological Survey's own assessment noted that the elevated rate of aftershocks may remain elevated for a year or longer. A year longer, which means that long after the last camera crew has gone home, long after you have forgotten the date, this coast will still be twitching, still be releasing small shocks in the fading rhythm of a main shock most of the world has already filed away as over. The story does not end when the news ends. The ground keeps speaking to almost no one. And now I have to give you the hardest truth of all, the one the experts sit with and do not enjoy, and I have to give it to you exactly, without softening it into prophecy and without inflating it into fear, because both of those would be lies, and you deserve neither. A small fraction of large earthquakes, only a small fraction, are preceded by smaller ones. We call those smaller ones foreshocks. But here is the cruelty buried in that word, and I want you to feel the full weight of it. A foreshock does not look like a foreshock. A foreshock looks exactly, precisely, indistinguishably like an ordinary earthquake, a standalone event, a coast doing what this coast does. It carries no mark, no signature, no warning label. It is only ever revealed to have been a foreshock afterward, in hindsight, at the moment the larger earthquake arrives and looks back and says, that one before me, that was the first knock. Until that larger event comes, if it ever comes, there is no test, no instrument, no seismologist alive who can look at a given quake and tell you whether it is a complete event, the whole story, finished, or whether it is the last, quiet warning before something greater. I am not telling you the 17th of July was a foreshock. I want to be as clear as language allows. No one knows that. No one can know that, not yet, perhaps not ever. What I am telling you is something more honest and in its way more unsettling. No one can rule it in, and no one can rule it out. That uncertainty is not a failure of the science. It is not a gap someone forgot to fill. It is the true and honest state of the art, the actual edge of what can be known about a system this large and this deep and this slow, and it is precisely that uncertainty, that inability to say which kind of event we just witnessed, that keeps the people who watch this coast turning it over in the quiet hours. Not fear, not prophecy, just the weight of an open question that cannot be closed from where we stand. So you cannot read the danger from the number. The number was too small a window, and it showed you the wrong room. You cannot read it from the depth or the location alone either, though they told you more than the magnitude did. To know whether this coast is winding towards something, or merely muttering in its sleep the way it has muttered for 10,000 years, you have to do the one thing the headline can never do. You have to stop reading the present. You have to read the past. You have to open the coast's own memory, the long ledger it has kept in stone and sediment, and in the fading records of everyone who ever lived and died along the Middle America Trench. And you have to ask it, plainly, what it did the last time it moved the way it moved on the 17th, because this rock has broken before, and the ledger, once you learn to read it, keeps a longer and stranger accounting than any of us would like. Part 4. A coast that remembers. A subduction coast does not forget. That is the first thing you have to understand about the ground beneath Chiapas. And it is the strangest thing, because forgetting is exactly what stone seems built to do. Rock is patient. Rock is silent. Rock gives you no diary, no ledger you can open with your hands. And yet in the only language it has, this coast keeps an account so precise that the scientists who read it can tell you, to within a fraction, how much is owed and how long the debt has been growing. I want you to hold on to that word, ledger, because it is the truest way I know to describe what is happening 70 kilometers down while the surface goes about its ordinary business. Here is how the account is kept. Every year, without pause, without ceremony, the oceanic plate offshore drives itself beneath the edge of the continent at a rate you could measure against the growth of your own fingernails. A few centimeters a year, no faster, no more dramatic than that. If the two plates could slide past one another smoothly, freely, like a draw running on oiled rails, there would be no ledger at all, and no earthquakes, only a quiet, endless creep that no one would ever feel. But they do not slide freely. Along vast stretches of the boundary, the rock is locked. Friction has welded the two surfaces together, and so the plate keeps converging while the join refuses to move. The plate advances, the seam holds, and the difference between those two facts has to go somewhere. Where it goes is into the rock itself, as strain. Picture bending a green branch slowly across your knee. It does not snap at the first pressure. It bends, storing the force you put into it in the tension of its own fibres, curving further and further, while appearing to anyone watching merely to be a branch under a hand. That stored bending is the debt. Every year the plates converge is another year of pressure applied to the branch, another increment loaded into rock that gives no outward sign of carrying it. This is the accumulation, the slow, silent, decisive part, and it can go on for decades, for centuries, for longer than any single human life can witness from end to end. The coast is bending, the coast is loading, and it does all of this in complete, untelling silence. The earthquake, then, is not the debt. The earthquake is the withdrawal. It is the single instant in which a locked segment finally overcomes the friction holding it shut, lurches forward to catch up with all the convergence it has resisted, and in doing so releases the strain that has been quietly stacking for a human age. The branch snaps, the drawer that would not budge flies open, and in that release, seconds long, sometimes less, the ledger for that one segment is reset towards zero, the account settled, the tension spent. This is why every great earthquake is, in a sense, a form of bookkeeping. It is the coast paying down what it borrowed, all at once, in the only currency the rock accepts. And the moment it is done, before the dust has even settled, the meter begins to run again. The plates have not stopped converging. They never stop. The next debt is already accruing. Now, if every segment of the boundary settled its account on the same schedule, the whole system would be, in its terrible way, predictable. A coast paying its dues at regular intervals, each region taking its turn. But that is not how it works. And the way it actually works is the thing that keeps seismologists awake, because along any plate boundary, some segments rupture often. They are, if you like, the responsible borrowers. They let go every few decades, in moderate releases, never allowing too much to pile up. And other segments do not. Other segments sit still. They lock and they load, and they say nothing, year after year after year, while the plate drives against them, and the strain climbs and climbs, and no earthquake comes to relieve it. To a casual eye, those quiet stretches look like the safest places on the whole coast. Nothing happens there. Nothing has happened there in living memory. And that appearance of safety is one of the most dangerous illusions in all of earth science. These quiet stretches have a name. They are called seismic gaps, segments of a plate boundary that have gone conspicuously, ominously long without a great earthquake, while the regions on either side of them have ruptured. And I need you to sit with the counterintuitive heart of the idea, because it inverts everything your instincts tell you about danger. A gap that has not broken in a very long time is not, for that reason, safe. It may be the opposite of safe. It may simply be the segment that has been storing its strain the longest, holding shut while its neighbours let go, quietly assembling the largest unpaid debt on the entire coast. To a seismologist, a long silence in a place that ought, by rights, to have ruptured is not a comfort. It is very nearly the most worrying sound there is. It is the ledger with the biggest number and no withdrawal in sight. Think of a long hallway of old doors, all of them swollen in their frames, all of them under the same steady pressure from the other side. One by one over the years, you hear them give. A bang here, a jolt there, each door releasing the moment it can no longer hold, and each release taking the edge off the strain on that particular frame. But there is one door at the end of the hall that has not moved. It has not so much as rattled in decades. And you might be tempted to think it the sturdiest of them all, the one you needn't worry about, until you understand that it is under exactly the same relentless pressure as every door that has already burst, and it has been absorbing that pressure without release for longer than any of them. It is not calm, it is loaded. The quietest, most swollen shut door in the hallway is not the safe one. It is the one that will jump hardest and travel furthest when it finally inevitably gives. Silence on a subduction coast is not the absence of danger. Silence is very often the sound of danger accumulating, and there is such a door on this margin. Not in Chiapas, northwest of it, up the same great Mexican subduction coast in the state of Guerrero. It is called the Guerrero Gap, and it is one of the most closely watched seismic gaps anywhere on Earth. It is a stretch of the boundary that has not produced a truly great earthquake in a very long time, while segments around it have gone through their cycles of loading and release. It has locked and it has loaded, and it has held its silence across a span that makes the seismologists who monitor it deeply, professionally uneasy. Not because they can name a date, but precisely because they cannot, and because the physics says the debt is there, growing, waiting. What sharpens the concern past the abstract is geography. The Guerrero Gap does not hang over an empty coast. It hangs, in a long-term sense, over Mexico City, a metropolis of more than 20 million people built, disastrously, on the soft former lake bed of a drained valley, ground that shakes like jelly in a bowl and amplifies the slow rolling waves that travel to it from the coast. Mexico's National Earthquake Early Warning System, which we will come to in time, was conceived and built in part to keep watch over exactly this threat, to give that vast, vulnerable city its handful of seconds of grace, should the gap ever let go. But I have to be careful with you here, and I want you to be careful too, because a seismic gap is one of the most misused ideas in all of popular science. A gap is not a prophecy. It does not carry a date. No one, not the sharpest seismologist alive, not the most sophisticated instrument ever built, can tell you the year, the month, or the decade in which the Guerrero Gap will break, or whether the way it breaks will match the worst that the physics permits. That is not a limitation we will one day engineer past. It is a feature of the system itself, which is chaotic in the deepest mathematical sense. Its outcome exquisitely sensitive to details buried beyond any reach. A gap is a statement of elevated long-term concern. It is a place where the account has grown large, and the withdrawal is, in the language of centuries, overdue. It is a reason to build warning systems, to strengthen buildings, to keep watching. It is not, and can never honestly be made into, a countdown. Anyone who hands you a date is selling you something that Earth has never once agreed to sell. So if the gap tells you where the debt is large, you might reasonably ask the other question, the one that gives the whole ledger its weight. Not where, but how large. How much can a segment of this particular coast actually owe? And what does it look like when the whole of that debt comes due at once? For the answer, you have to leave the present entirely and reach back across more than 2 centuries, to a night when this margin showed the full extent of what it is capable of. On the 28th of March in the year 1787, off the coast where Guerrero meets Oaxaca, the subduction zone let go on a scale that has not been equalled in the whole of recorded Mexican history. The earthquake is remembered as the San Sixto event, and its magnitude is estimated at around 8.6, a number that means very little until you understand that the energy released by an earthquake climbs not by addition, but by ferocious multiplication, so that an 8.6 is not a little larger than the 7.3 that struck Chiapas last week, but many, many times more powerful. A release from a different and far more terrible order of the scale. A great length of the boundary ruptured at once. Not a segment giving up a modest instalment, but a vast stretch of locked coast settling centuries of accumulated debt in a single, catastrophic withdrawal. And because the rupture was offshore, beneath the sea, the earthquake did not stop at shaking. When a great length of sea floor lurches upward in an instant, it lifts the entire column of ocean resting on top of it, and that displaced water has to go somewhere. It goes outward, as a tsunami. Picture the whole floor of a filled bathtub jerking upward at one end. The water does not stay politely in place. It heaves and it moves, and it climbs the walls. The historical records and the modelling that scientists have since built from them tell a sobering story about what came ashore that day. Waves reaching well over 15 metres at some points along the coast, modelled at around 18 metres near Corralero, a wall of water taller than a 5-storey building, rising out of a calm sea. And in the low-lying ground near the Oaxaca coast, the sea did not merely strike the shore and retreat. It pushed inland, in places, as far as 6 kilometres, seawater advancing across land that had never in memory known the ocean, drowning whole stretches of shore, redrawing the boundary between sea and country for as long as the water chose to stay. I do not raise 1787 to frighten you, and I certainly do not raise it as a prediction. It is not a forecast of anything. It is something more sober and more useful than that. It is the ceiling, the proof written permanently into the rock and the sediment and the fragmentary records of the people who survived it, of what this margin is capable of when it stops holding back and lets go fully. Every coast has such a number buried in its past, the maximum the machine has ever demonstrated it can produce, and for this stretch of Mexico, 1787 is very close to that number. It is the worst case not imagined but remembered. It tells you the true size of the account this coast is able to run, and that is precisely why the 17th of July has to be understood in its proper proportion, neither dismissed nor inflated, but placed correctly against the long ledger. The earthquake that shook Chiapas last week and the earthquake that drowned the Oaxaca coast in 1787 are not separate phenomena, not distant cousins, not different kinds of event that happen to share a country. They are products of the same machine, the same great subduction system, the same oceanic plate driving beneath the same continental edge, the same fundamental process of lock and load and release that has built and destroyed this coast for as long as there has been a coast to build. A different segment, yes. A vastly different scale, certainly. The 17th was a small withdrawal against a modest local debt. 1787 was the near total settlement of an enormous one. But it is the same coast, the same physics, the same ledger written in the same hand. And the point of setting them side by side is not to say that one will become the other. It is to make you feel, in your body, the range. To understand that this coast has done, and remains fully capable of doing, vastly more than it did on the morning of the 17th. What you felt last week was the machine clearing its throat. What happened in 1787 was the machine at the very top of its voice. Between those two moments, and between every such moment on every subduction coast that has ever existed, lies the thing I keep returning you to, because it is the whole truth of the matter. The strain a cruise in silence. It always has. Across the 239 years that separate 1787 from now, and across the centuries before that, and across the years since the 17th of July, the plates have never once stopped converging, and the debt has never once stopped growing, and none of it, not a single increment of that vast, slow, decisive loading, has made a sound a human being could hear. The bending branch does not creak, the swollen door does not rattle, the ledger is kept in perfect quiet, entry after entry, year after year, on a timescale that treats a human lifetime as a single held breath. The earthquake, when it comes, is not the arrival of the danger. The danger was always there, accumulating in the dark. The earthquake is only the instant the silence finally breaks. So you could, if you wanted, measure the true threat to this coast in centuries. You could hold up 1787 as the deep time worst case, the ceiling written into the rock, and let the sheer scale of it, the 8.6, the 18-metre wave, the sea walking 6 kilometres inland, stand as the warning. It would be an honest warning and a sobering one, but it would also be a distant one, an event so far back that it lives now only in models and fragments, easy to hold at arm's length as history rather than threat. And the truth is that you do not have to reach nearly so far to find the thing that genuinely haunts the people who watch this coast. You do not have to go back 2.5 centuries. You only have to go back 9 years, to something that happened not in the fragmentary records of the 18th century, but in living memory, in photographs and seismograms, and the recollections of people still alive to tell it, in very nearly this exact spot of the coast of Chiapas. And of everything the ledger holds, it is that recent night, and not the ancient one, that the 17th of July has made impossible to stop thinking about. Part 5. The Ghost of 2017, 9 years. That is all the distance there is between the ground that moved on the 17th of July and the last time this same coast did something no one who lived through it has been able to forget. Not a century, not a lifetime, 9 years, which is nothing at all in the memory of rock and very nearly nothing in the memory of a person. There are children on that coast now, in the towns behind those beaches, who are born into the aftermath of what happened, who have grown up in houses that were rebuilt because the old ones came down. And there are grandparents who can tell you exactly where they were standing, exactly what they were holding, exactly how the light behaved on the night the earth off Chiapas last decided to remind everyone what it is capable of. So when I tell you that this stretch of sea has broken before, I do not mean in some abstract geological deep time sense, the way a canyon remembers a river that dried up before there were people to name it. I mean recently. I mean within the span of a single mortgage. I mean that the warning you're looking for is not carved into ancient sediment or reconstructed from the diaries of colonial priests. It is sitting in the phones and the photographs and the grief of people who are still alive, still living within sight of the water, this very night. Let me take you back there. Late on the night of the 7th of September 2017, not morning this time, the way the July quake came, catching people mid-coffee and mid-commute. Night. Nearly midnight, in fact, at roughly 49 minutes past 11, local time, when most of the coast was already asleep or drifting toward it, when the towns had gone quiet and the lights had gone low, and the only sounds were the ordinary night sounds of a warm country settling into darkness. And then out beyond the surf, out where the seafloor drops away, and the trench begins its long descent, the rock let go. Not a magnitude 7.3, a magnitude 8.2. And I want you to sit with the distance between those two numbers, because the scale that measures earthquakes is a cruel and deceptive one, a scale that hides the truth of itself behind the modesty of small digits. 8.2 is not one number bigger than 7.3. On the scale that actually matters, the scale of energy released, 8.2 is something on the order of 30 times more powerful than the quake that shook the coast this July. 30 times. The gap between the two is not a step, It is a chasm. The epicenter sat roughly 87 kilometers to the southwest of a town called Chiapas, out under the Pacific, at a depth of about 47 kilometers down. And that figure, that 8.2, is not just a large number in a country that has known many large numbers. It is, by most of the ways we have of measuring these things, the strongest earthquake to strike Mexico in a century. That is not my phrase, reaching for weight. Mexico's own president stood before the country in the hours afterward and called it exactly that, the strongest in 100 years. It was the largest earthquake anywhere on the entire planet in all of 2017, on a globe that produces thousands of them every year. And in the long and painful catalogue of Mexico's own recorded history, it stood second only to a single event, the Great Quake of 1787, the one that dragged the sea a kilometre over the land and left it there for hours. The one I asked you earlier to hold in the back of your mind. Second in the history of a nation that sits astride one of the most active seismic margins on Earth. That is the company the September quake keeps. But here is the part that should make the hair on your arms stand up. And here is where everything I asked you to understand earlier comes quietly back to matter. The September quake was not the earthquake everyone had been bracing for. It was not the one the coast was, in a sense, owed. Remember the machine I took you down into, the great conveyor of the Cocos plate, sliding beneath Mexico along the Middle America Trench, the two slabs of rock locked together at their boundary, straining, storing, waiting to slip. The disaster everyone watches for on a subduction margin is the megathrust, the failure of that locked boundary itself, the plate interface tearing loose in one enormous shrug. That is the expected rupture. That is the one the models are built around. The September quake was not that. It broke the rules of its own catastrophe. It was an intraslab event, and I need you to feel the full strangeness of that word, because it changes everything about how you understand what happened, and about how you understand what could yet happen. Intraslab. Within the slab. The rupture did not tear along the seam where the Cocos plate meets the plate above it. It tore inside the Cocos plate itself, down within the cold, descending sheet of rock, as though the falling slab had turned on itself and broken its own back. Go back to the bent ruler I put in your hands earlier. Take that ruler, the thin, flat length of it, and bend it. Not to snapping, just into a smooth, straining curve, the way the Cocos plate curves as it plunges off the edge of the trench and bends down into the hot mantle beneath Mexico. Now, when a ruler finally fails, you expect it to fail at a joint, at a seam, where it is glued or fastened to something else. That would be the megathrust, the boundary letting go. But that is not what happened in September. Instead, imagine the bent ruler simply cracking along its own middle, the material itself splitting apart from the strain of the curve, the outer surface pulling away from itself because it is being stretched around the bend faster than it can hold. That is an intra-slab earthquake. The slab, bending down into the deep, is pulled apart by its own colossal weight. The cold, dense rock hanging into the mantle and dragging down on the rock behind it, stretching the descending plate until, somewhere inside it, the lithosphere simply tears. It is a normal fault, in the language of geologists, a pulling apart rather than a pushing together, which is a strange and counterintuitive thing to find on a margin where the whole story is supposed to be about compression, about two plates crushing into one another. Here, deep down, the story briefly inverts. Here the slab is not being crushed, it is being torn, by gravity, by its own descent. And in September of 2017, essentially, the entire thickness of that descending slab's rigid outer layer broke at once. Not a crack along one face, the whole lithospheric thickness of the plate ruptured through, top to bottom. That is why the number was so large. That is why an earthquake, 47 kilometers down, deeper than the shallow 15-kilometer break of this July, an earthquake that had to send its energy up through nearly 50 kilometers of rock before it even reached the seafloor, still arrived at the surface with enough force to become the strongest thing the country had felt in 100 years. I want you to understand why this particular kind of earthquake is its own species of menace, why the seismologists do not file it away as merely a curiosity of mechanism. An intraslab quake is deep, and depth on this coast does not mean distance in the comforting sense. It means the energy comes from below and beneath, from within the very foundation the coast is built upon, rather than from an offshore fault line you might imagine as separate from you, out there under the water. It is powerful, capable of the largest magnitudes because it can break the full thickness of a plate at once. And it is not the rupture the margin is watched for, which means that all the strain accumulating on the locked boundary, all the debt of the megathrust that the models track and worry over, is still there afterward. Untouched, unpaid, the intraslab quake does not relieve the pressure on the plate boundary. It happens alongside it, a second and separate way for this coast to break, a menace running in parallel to the one everyone already fears. The September quake did not settle the region's oldest debt. It simply demonstrated that there was more than one creditor. But I have given you numbers and mechanisms and analogies, and none of that is the reason the 9th of September lives, where it lives in the memory of that coast. Let me set the geology down for a moment, gently, and tell you the part that actually matters, the part that is the reason for this entire telling. The September quake killed 98 people. I am going to say that number slowly, because it is not a statistic. It is 98 separate endings, 98 lives that were ordinary and ongoing and full right up until nearly midnight, on a warm night in early autumn. 78 of them in the state of Oaxaca to the northwest, where the shaking found towns built of old brick and older stone and brought their walls down in the dark. 16 in Chiapas itself, along this same coast we have been standing on this whole time. 4 in Tabasco, more than 300 people injured, and around 1.5 million people affected in Chiapas alone. Their lives disrupted, displaced, damaged, in the space of the minute or two that the ground was moving. Some 41,000 homes damaged, which is not 41,000 buildings. It is 41,000 front doors, 41,000 kitchens, 41,000 places where someone kept their life. The economic loss reached something on the order of $4 billion, a figure so large it stops meaning anything, until you remember that it is assembled entirely out of small particular ruin, one collapsed shop and one cracked foundation and one destroyed harvest at a time. And it made a wave, a real one. The seafloor, when it broke, shoved the water above it, and that water ran for the shore and rose on the Chiapas coast to something approaching 1 3/4 meters. Nearly 6 feet of sea, arriving where sea is not supposed to be. I want you to hold that height beside the other one, the one from this July, the 33 centimeters, the wave you could measure against your own shin, the wave that barely registered as a wave at all, 1.75 meters against 33 centimeters. That is the difference the ocean drew between the two events, and it is worth holding quietly, without drama, because it tells you something true about proportion, about how the same coast can produce a ripple in one year and a genuine inundation in another, and about why no one who watches this water can afford to assume that the small wave is the only wave this sea knows how to make. 98 people. I keep returning to it because everything else in this account, all the mechanism and the magnitude and the intraslab strangeness, exists in service of that number, and not the other way around. The geology is only interesting because of what it does to people. The rock tearing 47 kilometers down is only worth understanding because, when it tore, 98 families learned what it means for the ground itself, the one thing you're taught from birth to trust, the very definition of solidity in every language humans have ever spoken, to fail beneath you in the dark. There is a dignity owed to that, a restraint, and I mean to keep it. These were not extras in a disaster. They were the whole point. So now, perhaps you can begin to feel the shape of the thing that moved through the minds of the people who study this coast, when the ground off Chiapas broke again on the 17th of July 2026. Because here is what binds the two events together, and here is the ghost of it. The 2017 quake and the 2026 quake happened on the same subduction system, the same great machine, the same descending Cocos plate, the same trench running its long line off the same coast. They struck offshore the same state. They fell within the memory, the direct, unfaded, living memory of the same people. The men and women who felt their houses shake this July are, many of them, the very same men and women who felt their houses shake or fall in September of 2017. It is not a comparison drawn across centuries by historians. It is a comparison drawn across 9 years by anyone on that coast old enough to remember both. That is the ghost. That is what haunts this. When the sea floor moved again on the 17th of July, the people whose profession it is to watch these things did not reach first for an abstraction, did not think of the July quake as a clean and isolated event to be logged and modelled and set aside. They thought of September. They thought of nearly midnight, and the 8.2 and the 98. The memory arrived before the analysis did, because that is how memory works, and because these are people and not instruments. I want to be careful here, and I want you to be careful with me, because this is exactly the place where fear likes to slip its hand into something it has no right to hold. The ghost of 2017 is not a prediction. It is not a promise that the July quake is the opening move of another September. Not a claim that the coast is doomed to repeat itself. Not some grim countdown ticking beneath the water. Nothing in the science permits that. Earthquakes cannot be predicted, only forecast as probabilities, as ranges of likelihood spread across years and decades. And anyone who tells you the coast is scheduled for catastrophe is selling you the one thing the Earth refuses to sell, which is certainty about its own timing. The 17th of July will not become the 9th of September. That is not how any of this works. But the ghost is the reason, the entire reason, that no one on that coast can look at a magnitude, 7 off Chiapas, and see only a number, because they have seen what this exact system, this exact stretch of sea, is capable of producing when it decides to produce it. They have the receipt. They have buried people over it. And so a 7.3, which in some other place, on some other margin, might be logged and mourned and moved past, becomes here a question that cannot be set down, a question with a face and a date attached to it, a question that 98 people already answered once. Not, will it happen again on a schedule, but we know for a fact in living memory what the worst version of this water looks like, and we cannot pretend we do not. That is not superstition. That is the opposite of superstition. It is the sober refusal to forget. And yet, even as the coast turned its face towards September of 2017 this July, there is a further cruelty in that year that the memory cannot help but carry with it. Because 2017 was not finished with Mexico on the night of the 7th of September. The 8.2 off Chiapas was the year's first blow, the one that came up out of the deep sea in the dark. But 12 days later, the country would be struck again, by something smaller in magnitude and infinitely crueler in its aim, an earthquake that would arrive not out at sea, but almost beneath the feet of the capital itself, and that would fall, of all the days on the calendar it could have chosen, on the one date the whole of Mexico already carried like an old wound that had never fully closed, the 19th of September. To understand why that date makes a nation flinch, you have to go back further still, past 2017 to another 19th of September, decades before, and to the thousands it took. Part 6. The Cruel Anniversary. You have to understand what September the 19th already meant to Mexico before a single stone moved in 2017, because the date was not a blank square on a calendar. It was a scar. It had been a scar for 32 years, carried the way a body carries an old wound that aches when the weather turns. And to feel the full weight of what happened 12 days after the great quake of September the 7th, you have to go back to a morning that an entire generation of Mexicans can still describe to you minute by minute. 7:17 in the morning, September the 19th, 1985. Most of the capital was doing the small, ordinary things that a city does at the start of a workday. Children in school uniforms, radios murmuring in kitchens, the first buses grinding through the intersections, offices filling floor by floor. And far away, 350 kilometers to the west, off the Pacific coast of the state of Michoacán, the same great machine that had broken the seafloor off Chiapas was breaking again. The Cocos plate, that slab of dense ocean floor, grinding down and under the edge of North America, seized and slipped along the subduction zone the way it had 100,000 times before the memory of anyone alive. Magnitude 8.0. An enormous release, one of the largest earthquakes the country had ever recorded. And it happened out at sea, far from where the people were. And here is where the story turns strange, and where I need you to slow down with me, because what happened next is one of the most important and least intuitive facts in all of earthquake science. That quake, 350 kilometers from Mexico City, did comparatively little damage near where it actually struck. The towns along the Michoacán coast, the places practically on top of the rupture, were shaken hard, yes, but they largely survived. And then the waves travelled. They rolled outward through the deep bedrock, across hundreds of kilometers of solid rock, losing energy with every kilometer the way a shout loses volume across a valley. By the time they reached the distant capital, they should have been a tired, diminished thing, a long, gentle sway, a city that far from the epicenter had every reason to expect to be spared. Instead, Mexico City was devastated. The place farthest from the wound bled the most, and to understand why, to really understand it, not just to be told it, you have to understand what the city is built on. Picture the valley where Mexico City sits. Centuries ago, before the Spanish drained it, that valley held a great lake. The Aztec capital rose on islands in the middle of that water, causeways reaching out to the shore, canals threading between the buildings. And over the generations, the lake was drained away, deliberately, to make room for a growing city. But you cannot drain away what a lake leaves behind. Beneath the modern streets lies the old lake bed, and the old lake bed is not rock. It is soft, wet, fine-grained clay and silt. The settled mud of centuries, saturated with water, soft as a thing can be, and still hold a building up. And soft, waterlogged sediment does something to a passing earthquake wave that hard bedrock never does. Think of it this way. Imagine you shout across a canyon of solid stone. The sound crosses cleanly, quickly, and it fades. Now imagine that same shout arriving at a valley filled with something soft and resonant, a great basin of jelly. The wave rolls in from the hard rock underneath, hits the soft basin, and slows down dramatically. And where a wave slows down, its energy has to go somewhere, so it piles up. In its swaying grows taller. The soft sediment traps the shaking. It cannot easily pass the energy along, so it holds it, and it magnifies it, sometimes many times over. The distant, tired waves that reached the edge of the old lake were amplified as they moved into it, growing from a gentle, diminished sway into a violent one. The very softness that made the ground feel stable in ordinary life made it monstrous in an earthquake. But amplification alone is not the whole of it. There is a second effect, and it is the true heart of what killed the city, and I want to teach it to you carefully, because once you understand it, you will never quite look at a tall building and the same way again. Every object has a natural rhythm, a rhythm it likes to sway at if you push it and let go. A child on a swing has one. Push at the wrong moment and nothing much happens, but push in time with the swing's own rhythm, again and again, matching it, and the arc grows higher and higher on almost no effort at all. A wine glass has one, a bridge has one, and the old lake bed of Mexico City, that soft, resonant basin of ancient mud, has one too. When you measure it, that basin has a natural sway period of roughly 2.5 seconds, meaning that when it is shaken, it prefers to rock back and forth in slow, deep pulses about 2.5 seconds long, and it rings at that rhythm the way a struck bell rings at its own single note. On the morning of the 19th, the earthquake's waves arrived and struck the basin, and the basin began to ring. Not randomly. At its own deep, patient period, over and over, back and forth, 2.5 seconds a swing, ringing like a bell that has been struck once and will not stop. Now here is the cruelty of the physics, the part that turns a natural fact into a catastrophe. A tall building has its own natural sway period too, and for a building that period depends, more than anything, on its height. A short, squat, 2-story house is stiff and quick, and it prefers to vibrate in a fast little buzz. A very tall skyscraper is slow and limber, and it sways in long, lazy arcs. But in between, in the range of buildings about 6 to 15 stories tall, the ordinary mid-rise blocks that filled the centre of Mexico City, the apartment houses and offices and hospitals, the natural sway period comes out to right around 2.5 seconds. The same number, the exact rhythm of the ground. I want you to sit with what that means, because it is the whole tragedy in a single idea. The ground was ringing at 2.5 seconds, and a certain class of building standing on that ground wanted to sway at 2.5 seconds. So the ground was pushing the building at precisely the rhythm the building most wanted to move, like a hand on the child's swing, timed perfectly. Push and push and push, each shove landing exactly in step with the last. This is resonance. This is the tuning fork struck at its own note. Strike a tuning fork, hold a second identical fork nearby, and the second one begins to sing on its own, drawing energy out of the air simply because it is tuned to the same pitch. The ground and these mid-rise buildings were tuned to the same pitch, and so they fed on each other. Every slow swing of the earth handed more energy to the building, and the building swayed a little wider, and the next swing of the earth arrived right on time to widen it again and again, the arcs growing, the walls straining, the structure moving farther with each pulse than it was ever built to move, until the frame could no longer hold and it failed. The buildings shorter than that range often survived. The buildings taller than that range often survived. It was the ones tuned to the ground's own note that were shaken apart, selectively, as if something had walked through the city choosing them. Around 412 buildings collapsed completely. Thousands more were left cracked and leaning and unsafe. The official death toll was placed at around 5,000 people, but almost no one believes that was the true figure. Many careful estimates run to 10,000 or higher, and the honest answer is that the real number was never fully known, swallowed in the chaos and the rubble, and the sheer scale of a capital brought to its knees in minutes. It remains, to this day, the deadliest earthquake in modern Mexican history, a quake that struck 350 kilometers away, out under the ocean, reached inland and rang a city like a bell, and brought its buildings down at the exact frequency of their own hearts. A nation does not forget a morning like that. Mexico did not forget. It took the 19th of September and made it sacred, a national day of remembrance, and more than remembrance, a day of preparation. Every year, on that date, the country holds an earthquake drill. Sirens sound across the capital. Millions of people, school children and office workers and shopkeepers stop what they're doing and file out into the streets, standing in the open, rehearsing the motions of survival, keeping the memory of 1985 alive in their own muscles so that the next time, because there is always a next time, they will know what to do. It is a solemn, sensible, deeply human thing. A country that was hurt on a certain morning, turning that morning, year after year, into a ritual of readiness. Now I need to tell you what happened on the 19th of September 2017, and I am going to tell it to you plainly, because it does not need to be dressed up. It only needs to be true. 12 days earlier, on the 7th, the great magnitude 8.2 had torn open the seafloor off Chiapas, the largest quake the country had seen in a century, the one you've been following through this story. And in the days that followed, a quiet assumption settled over the country, the kind of assumption that is entirely reasonable and entirely human. The year had delivered its blow. The great one had come. Whatever debt this coast had been carrying, surely it had now been paid, and the worst of 2017 was behind them. People exhaled. They began, slowly, to look away. Then came the 19th, the anniversary, the 32nd anniversary, to the day of 1985. And on that morning, as they did every year, the people of Mexico City held their drill. The sirens sounded. Millions went into the streets and stood in the open and rehearsed once more the memory of the dead. And then they went back inside, back to their desks and their classrooms and their kitchens. About 2 hours later, the ground moved for real. A magnitude 7.1, centered near the border of Puebla and Morelos, not far to the south. A different fault, a different mechanism than the great coastal quakes. A rupture deep within the descending slab rather than along its top edge, but close enough and strong enough that when its waves reached the capital, the old lake bed did again what it had done in 1985. It rang. Buildings swayed and cracked and, in more than a few places, came down. More than 300 people were killed. The same city, the same soft ground, the same date on the calendar. Hours after a nation had finished standing in the streets rehearsing this exact nightmare, the nightmare arrived and made itself real, as if the earth had waited for the drill to end before beginning the thing the drill was for. I have to be careful here, and I am going to ask you to be careful with me, because this is the moment where a story like this can slide into something it must not become. Let me first give the human weight of it its full due, because it deserves that. Imagine you're there. Imagine you have spent your whole life knowing what the 19th of September means. Imagine you stood in the street that very morning with the sirens in your ears and the memory of 1985 in your chest. And imagine that a couple of hours later, the floor lurches under you for real, and the walls begin to move. The disbelief of that. The sense, impossible to shake, that you're being mocked, that some intelligence has chosen this date, this exact anniversary of a nation's deepest wound, to reopen it. There is not a person alive who could stand in that street and not feel, in the animal part of the mind, that something meant it, that the coast was not merely indifferent but cruel, that the date itself was cursed. And now I have to tell you the truth, which is quieter and harder and, in its own way, no less staggering. The earth keeps no calendar. It does not know what day it is. It cannot know. A fault does not count the years since it last moved, does not mark anniversaries, does not read the date off a wall and choose its moment for the pain that moment will cause. There is no physical mechanism, none, not one that any science has ever found or could ever find, that links a date on a human calendar to the slow accumulation of strain in a slab of rock 40 kilometers down. The 19th of September 1985 and the 19th of September 2017 are joined by nothing at all except the arithmetic of chance. Two catastrophes, 32 years apart, falling on the same square of the calendar. It is a coincidence, a genuine, breathtaking, one in many thousands coincidence, and nothing more than that. But then why can we not let it go? Why does that coincidence lodge in the throat and refuse to be reasoned away, even when you know, even when you have just been told, that it means nothing? And the answer is not in the earth. The answer is in us. We are pattern-finding creatures. It is the oldest and deepest thing our minds do. It is what kept our ancestors alive, the ability to see the shape in the grass, to link the rustle to the predator, to find the thread of cause running through a chaotic world. We are built down to the root to refuse the idea that things simply happen. And a coast that has hurt us again and again over generations teaches that instinct to run wild. It teaches us to read the sea for omens, to see intention in the rock, to feel that a place which has taken so much from us must, surely, be keeping some kind of count. That is the tension you're left holding, and I do not think it ever fully resolves. The meaning we feel, pressing on one side, and the meaninglessness that is actually true, pressing on the other. The date means everything to us. It means nothing to the fault. Both of those things are real at once, and learning to hold them both, without letting go of either, is close to the whole of what it means to live, honestly, on ground like this. But there is a hard, practical lesson folded inside that coincidence, and it is the one that carries straight into everything that has happened since, straight into the summer of 2026. After the great quake on the 7th, the country believed the year's disaster had already come and gone. They believed that the big one had happened, and that having happened, it had brought them safety. And 12 days later, the ground proved that belief catastrophically, unforgettably wrong. That is the trap. That is the exact shape of the thing this coast has punished before, and will punish again. The quiet, comforting, deadly assumption that because the worst has struck once, it has spent itself, and you're safe now. The earth does not settle its accounts and then rest. The 7th did not earn anyone the 19th off, and a coast that broke twice in 12 days on a date already soaked in grief is not a coast that rewards the belief that the danger is behind you. Out of that second morning, out of the collapsed buildings of 1985, out of the thousands of dead, whose number could not even be counted, out of a city that learned in the cruelest possible way how much warning it did not have, something remarkable was born. Because in the ruins, Mexican scientists and engineers asked a question that sounds at first like a fantasy. The shaking travels through the ground at a certain speed. Radio signals travel faster. What if you could detect an earthquake at the coast the very instant it began, and send word inland faster than the shaking itself could travel, so that a city 300 kilometers away might have not 0 seconds, but 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute to brace before the ground arrived? What if you could hear the earthquake coming? And out of that question, one of the most extraordinary systems humanity has ever built to live alongside the machine beneath its feet, slowly, patiently, began to take shape. Part 7. The machines that listen. Out of the rubble of that September morning, when the ground beneath the capital had turned solid concrete into powder and taught a whole nation what it could not afford to forget, a strange and quietly astonishing idea began to take shape. Not a way to stop an earthquake. No one has ever imagined stopping one, and no one ever will. Not even a way to predict one, which remains to this day beyond the reach of any instrument on earth. Something humbler than either, and in its own way more remarkable. A way to hear the earthquake coming, a way to catch the first faint whisper of the rupture the very instant it began, and to run that news ahead of the wreckage, so that in the seconds before the shaking arrived, a city might already know. I want you to sit with how audacious that is. For all of human history, an earthquake was the definition of the thing that gives no warning. It was the archetype of the bolt from the blue, the disaster that arrives already happening, that is upon you before your mind has even formed the word for it. To promise a city even a few seconds of foreknowledge was to promise something that had never existed. And yet in the years after 1985, a Mexican organization called CIRES set out to build exactly that, and by 1991 they had it running, publicly, for real. The world's first earthquake early warning system offered to an ordinary population. It would grow over the years into the network, now known as SASMEX, the Mexican Seismic Alert System, and its eyes were turned, above all, toward the sea, toward the long, dangerous curve of the subduction coast, where the great ruptures are born, toward the offshore faults of Guerrero and Oaxaca and Chiapas, and in particular toward that ominous, quiet stretch, the Guerrero Gap, lying roughly 300 kilometers from the balconies of Mexico City. The system was built to watch the place where the next great earthquake would most likely come from, so that when it came, the capital would not be caught the way it was caught in 1985. Now, how can such a thing possibly work? How can any machine warn you of an event that travels through solid rock when the rock is right there beneath your own feet? The answer is one of the most elegant pieces of physics in all of earth science, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because once you understand it, you will never quite hear the word earthquake the same way again. When a fault ruptures, it does not send out a single push. It sends out several different kinds of wave at once, and this is the crucial part. Those waves travel at different speeds. Think of it like this. Imagine you strike a long steel rail at one end with a hammer. The sound races through the metal itself and reaches the far end almost instantly. The same blow travels through the surrounding air far more slowly, arriving a beat later. One event, two messengers, moving at two different paces. An earthquake is like that, except the messengers are all travelling through the earth, and the fastest of them is a wave we call the P wave, the primary wave, the first to arrive. The P wave is quick. It is a wave of pure compression, the ground squeezing and stretching along the direction it travels. The same way a sound wave moves through air, the same way a shove runs down a line of standing dominoes before any single one has toppled. And here is the mercy hidden inside the physics. The P wave, though it is fast, is relatively gentle. It is a herald, not an executioner. It rarely does much harm. It arrives as a sharp little jolt, a knock, a sudden nudge, enough to rattle a hanging lamp, enough to make a dog lift its head, and then it is gone. And for a moment, the world seems to hold its breath, because behind the P wave, moving slower, come the others. The S wave, the secondary wave, the shear wave, which whips the ground from side to side, and behind it the surface waves that roll along the skin of the earth, like swells across the sea. These are the slow ones, and these are the killers. These are the waves that throw furniture across rooms and snap columns, and bring the soft, old lake bed of Mexico City into that terrible rhythmic sway. The destruction rides in on the slow waves. The fast wave is only the announcement. So picture what that gap in speed makes possible. Out near the coast, close to where a great earthquake begins, you plant sensors, sensitive seismometers, watching, waiting. When a rupture starts offshore, the fast, harmless P wave reaches those coastal sensors first, seconds before anything dangerous has gone anywhere. In those seconds, a computer reads the shape of that first wave, recognizes with cold speed that this is not a passing tremor, but a large earthquake genuinely underway, and fires off an alert. And that alert does not crawl through rock. It flies. It goes out as a radio signal at the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers every second, immeasurably faster than any wave the earth can produce. The warning leaves the coast and outruns the earthquake. The message, racing through the air toward the distant city, passes the destruction near, still grinding its slow way through the ground, overtakes it, and arrives first. Hold that image, because it is the whole miracle in a single picture. The warning literally outruns the wave. The news of the disaster arrives before the disaster does. If that is hard to feel, try this. You have surely on some summer night watched a storm on the far horizon. You see the lightning flash, silent, sudden, complete, and you begin to count. 1, 2, 3, and only then, seconds later, does the thunder reach you, low and rolling, long after the light that made it. The light is your P wave, instantaneous, harmless, a pure announcement. The thunder is your slow wave, labouring across the distance. The early warning system is nothing more and nothing less than a way of seeing the flash and shouting the count down the length of the country before the thunder can arrive. Or picture a lookout standing on a high dune at the edge of a long, crowded beach. Far out, she sees a great wave stand up on the water, still distant, still seconds from shore. She cannot stop the wave, she cannot outswim it. But she can turn and cry out down the beach, and her voice, carried on the air, travels faster than the water ever will. By the time the wave arrives, the people nearest her are already moving. That is the alert system. A lookout at the edge of the sea, watching the fast, quiet wave that harms no one, and shouting the news inland faster than the wave that harms everyone can travel. And when that shout reaches Mexico City, the city hears it, all at once together. Scattered across the capital stands something on the order of 12,000 loudspeakers, mounted high on poles above the streets, wired to the alert. When the signal comes, they wail. A rising, unmistakable tone pours down over the avenues, and the plazas, and the schoolyards. A sound the whole city has learned in its body. A sound that means one thing, and only one thing. It is coming, now, move. In classrooms and offices and hospitals, special receivers pick up the same signal and sound the same alarm. And so a city of millions, people who have never met, who are scattered across hundreds of square kilometers, who a moment ago were teaching and operating and sleeping and pouring coffee, are handed all at the same instant the same small and precious gift. A shared handful of seconds, a few breaths of foreknowledge granted to everyone at once. I want you to think, really think, about what a person can do with those seconds. Because it is easy to hear 10 seconds or 20 seconds and imagine it is nothing. It is not nothing. It is very nearly everything. In 10 seconds, you can drop to the floor and crawl beneath a solid table and cover the back of your neck with your hands, which is the difference between a bruise and a crushed skull. In 20 seconds, a surgeon can lift the blade away from the open body on the table and step back and wait. In those same seconds, a train travelling at speed can begin to brake, so that when the ground begins to roll, it is crawling instead of racing and does not leave the rails. An elevator can be told to stop at the nearest floor and open its doors, so that no one is sealed in a steel box between floors when the building begins to move. A gas line can close a valve. A worker on a scaffold can grip the rail. A teacher can get 20 children under their desks and away from the tall windows. A person about to run out into the street, into the rain of falling glass and cornice and brick that kills so many in the first violent seconds, can instead freeze and stay and live. Panic runs toward danger. Warning lets you stand still in a safe place. While the danger passes, seconds, plain seconds, save lives. That is the entire purpose of the machines that listen. To turn a few moments of silence into a warning, and to spend that warning well. But now I have to tell you the hard part. The humbling part. Because this beautiful system, this triumph wrung out of catastrophe, carries within it a limitation so fundamental that no amount of cleverness will ever engineer it away. And once you understand the limit, you understand something deep and unsettling about the whole geography of this danger. The system works best for earthquakes that are far away. Let that land, because it runs against every instinct. We think of distance as safety and nearness as danger, and in one sense that is true. The closer you are to a great rupture, the harder it hits you, but the warning obeys the opposite logic, and it must, because the warning is made entirely out of distance. Remember the flash and the thunder. The lead time you're given is nothing but the gap between the fast, harmless wave and the slow, deadly one, and that gap only grows with the distance the waves have to travel. Far from the source, the fast wave and the slow wave separate, pull apart, string themselves out across the miles, and into that widening gap the radio signal slips and races ahead, and you get your seconds. But close to the source, the two waves have not yet had room to separate. They arrive almost together, one right on the heels of the other, and there is no gap for the warning to live in. The closer you stand to the beginning of the earthquake, the more the announcement and the destruction collapse into a single instant. And in 2017, in the space of 12 terrible days, Mexico saw both faces of this rule with a clarity that no textbook could ever match. On the 7th of September, far off the coast of Chiapas, in the deep offshore night, a monstrous earthquake tore open the seafloor, a magnitude 8.2, one of the largest the country has ever recorded. It was enormous, and it was distant, hundreds of kilometers from the capital, and so the system did precisely what it was built to do. The coastal sensors caught the fast wave, understood at once the scale of what was coming, and threw the warning inland, and Mexico City received, before the shaking arrived, something close to 2 full minutes of foreknowledge. 2 minutes, a lifetime. Long enough to wake, to rise, to gather a child, to walk calmly down the stairs and out into the open air and stand there in the dark, waiting before the ground had so much as trembled. The distance that made the earthquake so large was the very same distance that granted the city its warning. And then 12 days later, on the 19th of September, by that coincidence so cruel it hardly seems real, the exact anniversary of the 1985 catastrophe, a day the city spends every year in earthquake drills, a second quake struck, a magnitude 7.1 centered near Puebla, smaller than the Chiapas monster, but close to the city. And because it was close, the physics that had been so generous 12 days before now had nothing to give. The fast wave and the slow wave arrived almost as one. The alarm did sound, but by the accounting of that day, the warning reached people only around 5 seconds after the P wave had already passed beneath them, which is to say, the shaking and the siren arrived together. The announcement and the destruction collapsed into the same breath. For most of the city, there was no useful lead time at all. The machines were working perfectly. The physics simply would not allow them to help. There it is, laid bare, the cruel and unbreakable rule at the heart of every early warning system, ever built or ever to be built. The closer the earthquake, the less warning is possible. And for the earthquake directly beneath you, the fault that ruptures under your own street, under your own floor, there is no warning at all. There cannot be. The ground you're standing on is the sensor and the target at once, and the news has nowhere to travel from. You would feel the first wave and the killing wave in the same instant. The lookout on the dune can shout down the beach, but she cannot shout to herself. And now I need you to carry this back to the coast of Chiapas, gently, and look at what it means for the people we have been circling this whole time. Because on the morning of the 17th of July, the rupture happened offshore, close to the towns of that coast, the fishing communities and the small tile-roofed towns strung along the edge of the sea, nearest the epicenter, directly in line with the place where the seafloor broke. Those people are exactly the ones for whom the warning helps least. The alert that could hand a distant capital 2 full minutes of grace has almost nothing to offer the town, sitting on top of the rupture. For them, the ground arrives before any signal can. The flash and the thunder are the same event. The wave and the word are one. Sit with the shape of that, because it is the quiet injustice woven into the physics. The system is a gift for the faraway city and a whisper for the nearby town, and nothing at all for the village on the fault. The people closest to the danger are precisely the people the machines can least protect. The capital, 300 kilometers back, gets its warning built out of all that distance. The coast, standing where the earthquake is born, gets only the earthquake. And so the felt part, the loud part, the killing wave, reaches them without any herald at all, because the herald, the quiet P wave, the gentle first messenger, has no head start to give when there is no distance for it to run. Everything the system does is an effort to steal a few seconds of silence and turn them into a warning. But the silence has to be long enough to hold a warning inside it, and for the town, on top of the rupture, the silence lasts no time at all. So the machines listened on the 17th of July, exactly as they were built to. The sensors caught the first wave and did their work and sent their signal racing inland. And somewhere far from the coast, People were given their handful of seconds, and on the coast itself, where the sea had flinched and the ground had heaved, the warning and the earthquake arrived as one thing, indistinguishable, because that is the price of living where the earth does its work. And now the sirens have gone quiet again. The loudspeakers on their poles have fallen silent. The alarm tone has faded from the air. The receivers in the schools and the hospitals have stopped their wailing. The sequence goes on beneath the seafloor, faintly, the aftershock still muttering in the rock, the trench still shifting the way it has shifted for millions of years, indifferent, patient, and slow. The instruments keep their vigil, but the people are left with the part no machine can measure. Because a warning tells you that something is coming. It does not tell you what it means. And on this coast, where the ground reaches you before the word ever can, the question that lingers after the shaking stops is not the one the sensors can answer. So I want you to turn now, away from the machines, toward the people, the ones who live on this stretch of trembling coast, and the ones whose life's work is to understand it, and ask what they, standing in the quiet afterward, actually make of what the earth did on the 17th of July. Part 8, what the coast is saying now. Weeks have a way of doing what the shaking itself cannot. The shaking arrives and departs inside a single minute, and then the minutes pile into hours, and the hours into days, and the sheer ordinariness of being alive begins, slowly, to sand the edges off the memory. You go back to work. The cracked plaster gets patched or it does not. The bottled water you bought in a panic on the 18th gets drunk, one glass at a time, until the case is empty and you do not replace it. This is not weakness, and it is not stupidity. It is simply what a nervous system is built to do, because a nervous system that stayed at full alarm forever would burn itself out, and the body knows this even when the mind resists it. So the coast, in the ordinary human sense, begins to forget. And yet underneath that forgetting, something is still moving, because the sequence has not gone quiet, not fully. Weeks on from the 17th, the instruments that never sleep are still catching them, the small ones, the ones too faint to wake a sleeping child, but sharp enough to register on a screen in a monitoring room somewhere. A 2.1 here, a 3.4 there, a cluster of little releases along the same broken patch of seafloor, each one a tiny confirmation that the rock has not yet finished settling into its new shape. This is exactly what the science says should happen. Remember the pattern we walked through earlier? The way the aftershocks fall away, not on a clean schedule, but on a curve, fast at first and then slower and slower, a decay that stretches out long after the fear has faded. Omori's law, the old 19th century observation that has held up across more than a century of measurement, tells you that for a main shock of this size, the elevated rate of aftershocks does not vanish in a week or a month. It can persist for a year, longer sometimes. And it tells you something else, something quieter and harder to sit with, that during that long tail, a larger jolt is not impossible. Rare, yes. Unlikely on any given day, yes, but never quite zero. So I want you to imagine what that actually feels like, to live inside a decaying sequence. Because the science on the page is one thing, and the science in the body is another. Picture a house on the coast, an ordinary house, the kind with a tin roof that ticks in the afternoon heat, and a kitchen that opens onto a yard. Most days nothing happens. The sequence, for all its statistical presence, is invisible. The children eat, the radio plays, someone is frying something in oil, and the ground is just the ground, solid and dependable, and utterly beneath notice the way it is meant to be. And then without warning, on an afternoon indistinguishable from any other, there is a jolt. Not a big one, a small one, a single hard knock from below, as if something enormous turned over in its sleep just once, and then went still. And in that instant, every single person in that kitchen stops. The fork halts halfway to the mouth. The conversation cuts off mid-word. Every heart in the room slams against its cage and waits, all of them silently asking the same question at the same time. Is this it? Is this the big one? Is this the moment the story turns? And then the ground goes still, and the jolt was nothing, a 3.1, gone as fast as it came, and everyone exhales and pretends they were not afraid, and the frying resumes, and the radio plays on. That is the lived texture of an aftershock sequence. It is not constant terror. It is something stranger and more exhausting than terror. It is a low, fading drumbeat of, maybe, spaced out over weeks, most beats silent, and then one that lands and stops your heart before releasing it. And you learn, on that coast, to carry a small permanent question in the back of your chest. A question that never quite gets answered and never quite goes away. You learn to live with the not knowing, which is, in a sense, exactly the thing this whole story keeps circling back to. Now here is where I have to be honest with you, and even-handed, because what happens next is not underground at all. It happens on screens, in the hours and days after any large earthquake anywhere on Earth, and the 17th of July was no exception. A quake this size does not just shake the ground, it shakes the whole vast nervous system of the internet. And out of that shaking comes a wave, a flood of human reaction. Some of it is exactly what you would hope. Sober reporting, careful maps, seismologists explaining in plain language what happened and what it means. But that is not all of it, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Alongside the sober voices there rises every single time a great churning tide of something else. Prediction accounts, thousands of them, some sincere and some not, announcing that the signs are aligning. Voices declaring, with total confidence, that this was the precursor, that the big one is coming, that the date is near, that they have felt it, dreamed it, calculated it, decoded it. People stitching the 17th of July to other tremors, to the quakes that rattled Venezuela, to unrest at some other point along the great ring of fire that circles the Pacific, drawing bright lines between events thousands of kilometers apart, arranging them into a pattern, a countdown, an omen, a message. And I want to be very careful here, because it would be easy and lazy and cruel to simply mock this. I am not going to mock it, because the instinct underneath it is not stupid. The instinct underneath it is one of the oldest and most human things there is. Picture your distant ancestor on a dark plain, hearing a sound in the grass. The one who assumed the sound was nothing usually lived, and sometimes died. The one who assumed the sound was a pattern, a predator, a thing that could be anticipated and avoided. That one had an edge. We are the descendants of the pattern finders, the ones who could not stop looking for the thread that connects one danger to the next. And when the ground itself becomes the danger, when the very floor of your world turns out to be something that can betray you without warning, the hunger to find the pattern, to get ahead of it, to earn even a single hour of warning becomes almost unbearable. That hunger comes from fear, and the fear is completely understandable. And I will not stand here and pretend the people feeling it are fools. They are frightened. Fright wants a forecast. It is the most natural thing in the world. But here is where I have to draw a line, and I am going to draw it plainly and firmly. And then I am going to explain gently exactly where it sits, because you deserve the truth spoken without hedging. Earthquakes cannot be predicted, not by anyone, not by any agency, not by any scientist, not by any app on any phone, not by any animal, not by any pattern of clouds or aches in an old injury, or alignment of planets or folk method handed down through generations. No one, anywhere on Earth, can tell you the day, the place, and the size of the next earthquake. That capability does not exist. It has never existed. And despite more than a century of some of the most brilliant minds in science hunting for it with every instrument humanity can build, there is no credible sign that it is coming. The honest answer to the question, when is the big one? The only honest answer is this: we cannot know, and anyone who tells you they can is wrong. Sincerely wrong or deliberately wrong, but wrong. And I want you to hold on to that, because it is easy to hear it as despair, as science throwing up its hands, and it is not that at all. Let me show you the difference, because it is one of the most important distinctions in this entire field, and once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. There is a difference between prediction and forecast, and it is not a matter of degree, it is a matter of kind. Prediction is prophecy. The day, the hour, the place, the size. That science cannot do, and honestly says so. But forecast is something else entirely, and forecast is real, and it is powerful. Think of the difference between a weather prophet who claims to know it will rain at 3:14 in the afternoon on a specific Tuesday next year, and a meteorologist who tells you that this valley gets heavy rain most autumns, that the pressure systems are lining up in a way that raises the odds this week, and that after a first storm passes, a second one often follows within days. The prophet is a fraud. The meteorologist is doing real, careful, honest work, and their work saves lives, and it never once pretends to certainty it does not have. That is exactly what earthquake science can do, and does. It can look at a fault, and over spans of decades and centuries, estimate the probability that it will rupture, based on how fast strain is loading and how long it has been since it last let go. It can map across an entire region where the strain is running high and where the rock is closer to its breaking point. And after an event like the 17th, it can estimate the odds of aftershocks, the shape of that decaying drumbeat, the small but non-zero chance of a larger jolt in the tail. Those are real powers. They are the difference between a coastline that builds its schools to survive and a coastline that does not. But not one of them is prophecy. Not one of them can hand you a date. And the scientists who do this work are almost to a person the first to tell you so, because their honesty about the limit is precisely what makes everything inside the limit trustworthy. So what can we actually say about the 17th of July? Carefully, without overclaiming, without either inflating it into an omen or dismissing it into nothing. We can say this. The rupture released strain on its own patch of the fault, the section that had been locked and loading, and in releasing it, the Earth did what we saw earlier. It did not simply discharge that tension into empty space, it redistributed it. The stress that patch had been holding got handed, in part, to its neighbours, the adjacent locked sections up and down the trench, which now carry a little more load than they did on the 16th. We can say that the Cocos plate, the great slab of ocean floor grinding beneath the edge of North America, keeps converging at roughly 6.4 centimetres a year, the width of a hand every year, patient and indifferent, whether anyone is watching or not, whether the 17th happened or not. We can say that this stretch of coast remains one of the most seismically active places on the entire surface of the planet, a place where the ground is not a stable floor, but a slow, grinding machine that has produced disaster before and will again. And we can say one more thing, the hardest thing, the thing that sits right at the centre of it all. The possibility that the 17th was a standalone event, an old debt paid and closed, is just as real as the possibility that it was the first quiet instalment on something larger. And no one, right now, can tell you which. I know how that lands. I know the mind wants that sentence to resolve, wants the science to lean one way or the other, to at least whisper a preference. But it does not, and it cannot. And I need you to understand that this is not a failure and not a dodge and not a scientist hiding behind caution. That irreducible uncertainty is the truth. It is the actual shape of what is known and not known about a fault system in the days after it moves. And far from being a cop-out, it is the very thing that keeps the seismologists at their screens through the night. If they could resolve it, they would rest. Because they cannot, they watch. The not knowing is not the end of their attention. It is the reason for it. Which brings me quietly to the thing this whole story has been building toward, the contrast that has been sitting underneath every word. In the weeks after the 17th of July, there came to be, in a sense, two kinds of people on that coast. And the line between them is not the line you might expect. On one side are the people who felt the shaking and forgot it by dinner, who felt the floor move, waited out the minute, checked that the walls still stood, and then, being human, being resilient, being busy with the enormous ordinary work of staying alive, let it slide back into the vast pile of things that happened once and did not happen again. There is nothing wrong with these people. In a way, they are the healthy ones, the ones the nervous system is designed to produce. They felt the loud part, and the loud part passed and they moved on. And on the other side are the people who cannot forget, the seismologists, whose whole vocation is to refuse the forgetting, to treat each small tremor not as an isolated startle, but as data, as a sentence in a paragraph, in a story that runs for centuries. The survivors of 1985, who felt this coast take everything once, and who never again heard a rumble without their whole body going cold and listening. The survivors of 2017, closer, fresher, who know exactly what the ground is capable of and exactly how fast it can turn. The people who have lived long enough and paid close enough attention to have learned to read a small quake the way a literate person reads a word. Not as a random mark, but as part of a sentence, and the sentence as part of a story that began long before them and will not end within their lifetimes. And here is the thing I most want you to hold on to about these two kinds of people. The difference between them is not fear. The forgetters are not braver, and the rememberers are not more afraid. The difference is memory, and it is attention. It is the willingness, or the inability, to keep listening to a thing that has gone quiet. Because the ground has gone quiet again, mostly. The sirens are silent. The drumbeat is fading, beat by beat, along its long, slow curve. And most of the coast has gone back to frying dinner and playing the radio, as it should, as it must. But somewhere the instruments are still catching the little releases, still tracing the shape of the sequence as it decays, still watching the neighbours of the broken patch for any sign that they too are ready to let go. And the people who watch are not watching out of panic, and they are not dismissing it out of denial. They are doing the harder, stranger third thing, the thing that this whole story has been reaching toward from the very beginning. They are listening to a language spoken not in words but in strain and slip and silence, in the width of a hand each year, and the sudden release of a century's patience in a single shallow minute. A language the earth has been speaking on this coast for longer than there have been people here to hear it, and one that we, with all our instruments and all our century of careful work, have only just begun to learn how to read. Part 9. The signal we cannot read. So let us stand finally where all of this has been leading. At the edge of the water, on the coast of Chiapas, on an ordinary evening some weeks after the 17th of July, with the sirens long silent and the sea gone flat and calm, lying against the shore as gently as if it had never in its life reached up to flinch at anything at all. The tide gauges read nothing unusual. The loudspeakers on their poles are quiet. The news has long since moved on to other mornings in other places, and beneath all of that stillness, unchanged and unhurried, the machine is still running. That is the first thing I want you to carry out of here, because it is the truest thing, and it is the thing the calm surface is most designed to make you forget. Nothing that mattered has stopped. The Cocos plate is still diving beneath the edge of the continent. Tonight, at the speed of a growing fingernail, 6.5 centimetres a year, exactly as it was on the 16th of July before any of this began, exactly as it will be on some ordinary morning years from now. The strain is still loading into the locked boundary and into the bending slab. The ledger is still open, and the entries are still being made, one silent increment at a time, in a hand no instrument can hear and no siren can announce. The earthquake of the 17th was not the danger arriving. The danger was always here. The earthquake was only the single instant the silence let us listen. And this is where I have to give you the honest shape of the answer, the whole of it, because you have followed me a long way down into the dark, and you have earned it. We do not know. That is the truth at the centre of all of it, and I will not dress it in anything warmer. We do not know whether the 17th of July was this coast quietly settling an old debt, a moderate release on a modest patch, an event complete in itself, finished, closed, or whether it was the first low word of a longer sentence, a redistribution of stress that has nudged some silent neighbour a little nearer its own edge, a foreshock that will only be revealed as one by whatever does or does not follow it. Both of those remain true at once, and there is no instrument on earth, no scientist, no model, no method that can stand on that shore tonight and tell you which. That uncertainty is not a gap that better science will one day close. It is the honest edge of what can be known about a system this vast, this deep, and this slow. So what, then, is a person supposed to do with that? If you cannot be told the day, if the prophets are frauds and the pattern finders are only frightened, if the earth keeps no calendar and answers no questions, then how are you meant to live on a coast like this one? And the answer, it turns out, is neither of the two things the frightened mind reaches for. It is not dread, the constant clenched waiting for a catastrophe that may not come in your lifetime, because dread is exhausting, and it changes nothing, and it steals the ordinary days that are, in the end, almost all the days there are. And it is not denial, the comfortable pretense that because the ground is quiet tonight, it will be quiet always, because that is exactly the belief this coast has punished before, the same belief that let a nation exhale on the 8th of September and be broken again on the 19th. The honest response is the harder, humbler thing that sits between them. You understand the danger clearly, and you do not look away from it, and then you prepare plainly and practically for the thing you cannot predict. You learn where you live. If you are on a coast like this one, you know which ground is soft and which is firm. You know whether the sea can reach you. You know that if the shaking is long and strong near the shore, the oldest rule is to move to higher ground without waiting to be told. You secure the heavy things that could fall on the people you love, the tall shelf, the water heater, the cabinet above the bed. You keep a little water, a little food, a light, the small unglamorous supplies that turn a catastrophe into an inconvenience. You learn the 3 words that have saved more lives than any prediction ever will. Drop, cover, hold on. You sign up for the alert if you live where the alert can reach you in time, and you make your peace with the fact that if you live on top of the fault, it may not. And then, having done all of that, you let the ordinary days be ordinary. You live fully, without pretending either that you're safe or that you're doomed, because the truth, as it almost always is the harder and quieter thing in between. Because here is what the coast is in the end, when you strip away the fear and the prophecy and the headlines that come and go in an afternoon. It is not malevolent. It is not counting the years to your anniversary. It is not sending you a message, or a warning, or a punishment, whatever the animal part of your mind insists as it stands at the edge of the water. It is a machine, indifferent and magnificent, and old beyond any human sense of old, doing what it has always done, building this coast and unbuilding it in the same slow breath, on a clock that treats the whole of recorded human history as a single held moment. The sea flinched on the morning of the 17th. 22 million people felt it. 2 were hurt. The wave rose the length of a forearm and lay back down, and every part of that, the shaking and the stillness that followed, was the same machine, speaking the only language it has ever spoken, in strain and slip and silence. We received the signal. That much we did. The sensors caught it, the instruments recorded it, the models turned it over, and 22 million people felt it pass through their bodies on an ordinary morning, and knew for 1 minute that the floor of the world is not as fixed as it pretends to be. We received it perfectly. What we could not do, what we still cannot do, standing here on the shore with a century of careful work behind us, is fully read it. We have learned to hear the earth speak. We have not yet learned to understand everything it says. And so, we are left where this coast always leaves the people who are honest with themselves about it, listening to a language we are only just beginning to learn, on the edge of an ocean that has crossed itself to reach us before, and will do so again on some morning we cannot name. The ground north of the trench has gone quiet again. The aftershocks are fading along their long, slow curve, beat by beat, into the ordinary silence of a coast at rest. But the slab beneath it has not stopped moving. It never does, and somewhere down in the dark, in the locked and loading rock that no drill will ever reach, in the patient bending of a plate that has been diving beneath this coast since long before the first person stood here and wondered why the ground had shaken, the strain is still climbing. 1 fingernail's width a year, silent, certain, waiting for the day, near or unimaginably far, when the silence breaks again, and the coast sends the next word of a sentence it began speaking long before us, and will go on speaking long after. Rest now. The sea is calm tonight, and the ground is still, and that is enough. The coast will keep, as it has always kept until morning, and when it speaks again, whenever that is, at least now, you will know what you're listening to.